Today we're going to be going over how to create your own at-home Jarrarium. So a Jarrarium is basically just what it sounds like. It's a little aquarium made of a jar. So I'm going to show you a couple that I already have made, and then I'm going to walk you through the process of how to make your own. I'm using just an everyday jar, and then later I'll show you guys some of the stuff that has popped up in my jars and go over a little bit of the biology and some of the organisms that we're going to find in these jars. So let's go ahead and get started, and let's get to making our first Jarrarium. Alright, so the first thing you're going to need to do, basically the only material you're going to need is a glass jar. Now preferably you're going to use a glass jar over something like plastic because the glass is a lot more visible, so you'll be able to see into it a little bit better, and the light will be able to get in there a little bit better too. So you can use any size jar, just make sure it's big enough to hold what you want in it. So you can make them as big or small as you want. Just remember that the bigger the jar is, the more stuff you can have in it, and the more potential you have to see something really interesting. So in my case, I'm just using this old salsa jar that I had laying around the house. Washed it out, took the label off. Now I'm going to go use it to put some stuff in it. So for this next step, all you're going to need to do is go down to your local body of water. So if you have a pond or a lake nearby, just head down there. So in my case, I'm going down to my local neighborhood pond. Brought my jar along with me. And so you're going to want to look for a space along the bank that is pretty open. There's not too many plants, so you can get in there and get to the water. Preferably not too rocky, because you're going to need to be able to get into the mud to get some dirt in your jar. But some rocks isn't bad. So check out these two areas here. Looks like this area on the left is more suited for what I'm going to do. Go ahead and get started on the next step. All you need to do now is reach in there with your jar, scoop up some of that dirt. Make sure you have a little bit just to cover the bottom. You don't want too much. Now this next step is optional, but I like to go ahead and grab a couple rocks from the bank there and just put them right in the jar. Basically gives it a little bit of structure, makes it look like there's something at the bottom so it's not just bare. So I went ahead and got too much dirt on accident, so all you gotta do if you do that is dump a little bit out and then fill it up again with some water. If you've seen my last video, you know there's tons of crawfish in this water. So sure enough, I looked up and saw this guy crawling around right in the water. I also saw these two guys slithering their way through the water. Now these are just two of the common harmless water snakes that hang out around this pond. So if you're down at a pond, make sure you keep an eye out for snakes. Most of the time they'll just be these non-venomous ones, but there are venomous guys hanging out down there, so be careful. These guys were harmless though. Now since these Jarrariums are going to be sealed, they're going to need some source of oxygen. So go ahead and add in some plants that you can see. Typically you're going to want to get some aquatic plants in the water. In this case I could only find some that were along the bank, but they'll do for now because these are going to provide oxygen to the Jarrarium. So now you're pretty much at the end of your building. So all you're going to need to do is put your cap back on, take your jar home and place it under some light. So personally at my house we have a little arrow garden which has some LED lights that provide just the right amount of light for our plants. But if you don't have one of those, you can just go ahead and put it on a windowsill. Make sure it gets enough sunlight so that the plants can thrive. Make sure that windowsill doesn't get too hot though, because you wouldn't want to cook all your organisms that you got in there. So make sure it's good temperature, it has good amount of light, and you should be just fine. So by now you're probably wondering what this jar of dirty water is going to look like. So the only thing you need to do to solve that is just sit and wait. So the water's going to be all dark and murky for now, but as time goes on, that dirt that's all suspended in the water column is going to sink to the bottom, and your water should clear up really nicely. And that sometimes that can take a couple hours, sometimes it can take a day or two. So just let it sit overnight, preferably. In the morning, it should start getting clearer and clearer, and you should be able to start seeing some of the jar come to life and start seeing some organisms crawling around in there. So for now, let's move on to the next part of the video. I'm going to go ahead and show you guys some of what I found in my jarrariums from the same pond, and we'll go over some of the different organisms, take a look at what we're working with, and I'll work you through some aquatic biology and show you that there's way more going on in these ponds than you think there are. It's not just fish swimming around in there. There's all sorts of crazy life in there. We'll take a look at a little bit of that today, and hopefully you guys will get to see some in yours in the future. So this is my first jar. I went out and got this, about 3 weeks ago now. And at first, like I mentioned earlier, it was all murky and ugly. It looked like chocolate milk. But over time, you'll see it cleared up really nicely. It's actually crystal clear now. The plants are growing in real nice. And I've seen a lot of cool things come out of this jar. From the first day, you'll see a lot of small things. Probably the first thing you'll see is a lot of small little, what they're called copepods, bouncing around in there. You'll think it's just little particles of dust or dirt, but they're actually little bugs swimming around in the water. So first, let's go over a little bit about those, and then we'll move on to some of the other stuff we got in here. So these little guys that I've been talking about are called zooplankton. So zooplankton isn't actually one specific thing. It's what they call all of the little plankton that swim around and are alive within the water column. So I'm sure you all know Plankton from SpongeBob. He's based off of these small creatures. It kind of looks like the one here, actually. So this one here is a copepod. So you'll see they have two big antennas, these big little round bodies. There's not a lot going on with them. That's going to be the common trend with a lot of these little guys. They're pretty simple, but they are vital for any body of water to survive. So if you ever see really small fish in the water, what do you think they eat? This is what they're going to eat. So they're going to be eating these small plankton that are swimming around in the water column, just chomping them up. So these guys are everywhere. So when I first opened my little jar, this was the first thing I saw. There was tons of these and the ones I'm going to show you next swimming around in there. They were everywhere. So the fish definitely have plenty of stuff to eat. And if the pond is healthy, which this one is based off of the presence of all of these, they're going to have tons of these in there. So let's go ahead and take a look at the other one, the water flea. So this guy here is called a Daphnia, but the more common name that you'll hear is the water flea. They're called this because they're smaller than fleas are, and they're in the water, so they look kind of like them. So you'll see these guys all over the place, just like the copepods I mentioned. They'll be kind of jumping around through the water column, it looks like, because they don't really have fins or anything to swim. They just have these little legs that they kind of push themselves around with. They're a little bit faster than you think they were. So if you look in there, oftentimes you'll see them jumping around back and forth. But remember, you have to look really closely because these things are basically microscopic. So if you get up real close in there, shine a light in your jar, you might be able to see a few of these. Remember, like I said, these are what a lot of the fish and organisms in the water are going to be eating. So very important to the ecosystem. So the next thing we're going to go over, which is probably my favorite thing you can find, are going to be the different bugs that you can see within your jars. So for this first one here, we have this little white bug. I've seen a couple of them pop up throughout my jar. This was pretty cool. And these are what's called ephemeropterans, or mayflies. So these are actually the larval form of the big winged flies that you'll see flying around the bodies of water. And so these flies will spend most of their lives in this larval form before they pupate and emerge, kind of like a butterfly will, out into the outside world, out of the water. So they'll spend most of their lives in the water and then change, and they'll fly around for a little while before they pass. So you'll know that this is one of these mayflies because of its tail. If you look here, you'll see that it kind of splits out into three little strands right there at the end, and that's how you know that this is a mayfly. If you only see 2 strands, like you see here on this one, this is actually going to be a different kind of bug. So this is called a stonefly or a plecoptera. So these are going to do the same thing that the mayflies do. They'll spend most of their lives in the water, swimming around, crawling around, and then eventually they'll change into these ones with wings and fly out of the water. So remember, 3 tails, it's a mayfly. 2 tails, it's a stonefly. This is some footage I got of one of the mayflies larvae crawling around at the bottom of my jar. There's a little snail there that he's saying hi to, but these guys will come and go very quickly. Even though it looks like they're moving so slow, they can still jet out and disappear just as quick as. The next bug that I was lucky enough to see was what's called a lepidopteran, or a aquatic moth. So these work the same way as the flies do, believe it or not. So they'll start out in what's basically like a little caterpillar, like you'll see here, and eventually they'll pupate and turn into the moths that you see flying around every day. Now, when I was first going through my jar, I thought I saw something that looked pretty similar to this caterpillar here, but I wasn't sure because it was very small, and I thought it might be dead or just a weird-looking weed. But I was wrong. So apparently, a week or 2 later, I came back to the jar, and I saw something at the top out of the water, and I was really concerned about what it was or how it got there, because I thought somebody had maybe opened the jar. And then I remembered this guy, and after doing a little bit of research, I figured out what it was. So to do this, I went ahead and opened up the jar, which was kind of risky because I was afraid he was going to fly away, but I just couldn't get a very good look at him because he was sitting right on the rim there. So I went ahead and risked it and opened the jar, and luckily he stayed put and let me get a couple good pictures of him. So here he is here. You see he looks very different from that caterpillar that we saw earlier. He's got wings and legs and eyes now, so looks completely different. But believe it or not, this is what came from that caterpillar. And so he's a very small guy, but this just goes to show you that I'm not lying. These things will change form and fly away, because that jar was closed the entire time. There's no way a moth could have flown in there and gotten stuck because it was sealed. So I believe that this one actually transformed while it was stuck within the jar, which is pretty neat in my opinion. So if you do this and you see one of these in there, if you see any of these bugs, really know that they might change and you might have something flying out at the top eventually. So be sure to check it regularly, open it up, and be ready for something to fly out at you. So when I went ahead and opened up that jar to get that moth out, I looked close and I noticed there were these little small things kind of crawling around on the top, it seemed like, on top of the water. So I took a picture, and then when you take a closer look, it turns out that these are actually some really small beetles. So I believe these are what are called hemiptera, or water beetles. I'm going to have to do a little more research, but I've never seen these guys in there until this morning when I let that moth out of there. So pretty cool new find. It just goes to show every day you might see something new when you're looking at this. And as I'm recording this, I actually noticed something to the right here in this picture. So with that, we can go ahead and move on to this next section, which is going to be over hydras. So like I said, when I was talking about this beetle here, I noticed something small on the right next to it that I hadn't realized before until I was recording this. So let's go ahead and zoom in there, take a closer look, and I'll show you what we got. So this guy right here, you see, it kind of looks like it's part of the plant, but if it's on the right here, you see there's some small strings that are coming out of that thing right at the end. So this is actually what's called a hydra. So these are very small, look like plant-like creatures that'll stick to the walls of the jar or on plants like this one here. And they have these little arms that go out, and they use those arms to collect little plankton and stuff that swim by. So this is how they eat. So if they catch something in one of those arms, they'll bring it into their mouth, which is at the base of that tip there, and they will eat it. So I actually didn't know that any of those were in this jar, and my second jar is full of these hydras. But this is actually the first one I've seen in this jar. And so I'll show you some more pictures from that second jar now. So this one's a little more clear, and this one's actually sticking to the side of the jar. There's one there right in the open, and if you look to the right on that plant there, there's one on one of the roots. So they actually have what's called a basal disc, which is basically the bottom of the hydra that allows them to stick to things and actually lets them move around. So obviously this hydra wasn't always on the side of this jar. I didn't put him there, so he had to have gotten there somehow. So odds are he used that disc to kind of slide his way up the side of the jar, or perhaps off that plant there and onto the side, which gives him better access to the prey and the other items that are swimming by. This next picture, you can see another hydra up there towards the right at the top. But we're going to kind of shift focus onto the other organism in picture here, which is going to be this clear yellowish looking tube thing here. So this is what's called a flatworm or a planarian. So these are just what they sound like. They are worms that are flat. So this one is actually crawling along the side of the jar here. And oftentimes it can get a little bit bigger than this. This one's still pretty small. And at the tips, you can see how they kind of like are big and then they shrink and then they get a little bit bigger again. So oftentimes when they get bigger, their eye spots, or they'll have two little dots that look like eyes. They're called eye spots. They'll become more prominent, and you can actually see their little faces. So you'll notice that there's like a yellow line in the middle of them. And so that's what's going to be their digestive tract. So all that in there is digestive tract. And so they're going to go along the side of the jar, along the plants, munching on the stuff that's on there, collecting that. And then it'll move into their digestive tract, nutrients, and keep going along their way. This picture here isn't nearly as clear. As you can imagine, it's kind of hard to get detailed pictures when everything in here is so small. But you can kind of see the two little eye spots there on the bottom left that I was talking about. That's those two white dots. And so when they get bigger, you'll notice they also have kind of like a triangular-ish head. And so the sides of that head, they have what's called ocelli. So they're almost like ears in the way they work. So they use them to sense things in the environment around them. That's basically how they get their way around. So they'll feel around with those, and then they'll also use their senses and their eye spots to figure out where they're going and where their next meal is going to be at. So next up, I'm going to talk about these guys here, which are the aquatic snails. So one thing I've noticed in making these jars, that every time I've made a jar, I always end up with one or two snails. And those snails will turn from 2 snails into like 4 or 5 snails in no time. So this one here is actually the biggest snail that I have in my jar. Still not very big, smaller than your pinky. But you'll notice him before you notice anything else. Crawling around the side, crawling on the plants. They're actually a little bit faster than you'd expect them to be. They are snails, so they're still slow. But compared to the rest of the stuff in the tank, these things can move pretty quickly if you don't watch them. You'll look at him 1 second, he'll be in one spot. You turn around, do something, look back, he'll be on the other side of the jar, just cruising along. So these are my favorite things to look at in there, just because they're so active. They have so much energy in them. They're always going back and forth along the tank. And they can actually look really cool. So a lot of the snails, they'll have their 2 little antennas. So you'll be able to see those pretty clearly depending on where it is. And oftentimes they'll have really cool shell designs. So this last one here, you can see he has kind of a spotted black and yellow shell. Oftentimes they won't develop these colors until they're a little bit bigger, which is this guy here. He's the biggest one in both of mine. So hopefully he's got a little bit more growth in him. And then all the rest of the little ones that I see in there, hopefully they'll get up to this size to where at one point we can eventually see all of their colors. So those are pretty much the main things that I've seen in my jar. So I look forward to hopefully you guys trying out some jars, going out there getting some cool stuff, and seeing what y'all get. It's been pretty fun. It's a very simple thing to do. As long as you got some water in a jar, you can see all sorts of different stuff that you didn't know was there beforehand. So eventually, I'm going to go ahead and open these jars up and put them back into the water where I found them, because nothing wants to be stuck in the jar its whole life. So I'll go ahead and release those. But I hope you enjoyed the video and learned a little bit about aquatic biology and all the small things that you can see in the water that you probably didn't know were there before. And be a little bit more appreciative when you go and stomping around the water. Think about all the little things that you might be messing with.